Maple Hollow, Massachusetts, January 1887. The winter of 1887 was particularly unforgiving in Maple Hollow. Snow piled in drifts taller than a man, and the wind howled through the pines with such ferocity that locals swore it carried voices, warnings perhaps that went unheeded. The small town, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, was known throughout the region for two things: its maple syrup and the Maple Hollow Methodist Church Choir. The latter had gained considerable fame over the years, drawing visitors from as far as Boston to hear their harmonies during special performances. Reverend Thomas Blackwood stood at his office window, watching as choir members trudged through knee-deep snow toward the chapel. The rehearsal had been his idea, despite the brewing storm. The regional competition was only 3 weeks away, and they needed the practice. "Are you certain this is wise, Thomas?" Mrs. Blackwood asked, placing a hand on her husband's shoulder. "The storm looks to be worsening." "The Lord provides shelter to those who serve him," the Reverend replied, his breath fogging the glass. "Besides, most live within walking distance. They'll be home before the worst hits." What neither the Reverend nor anyone else in Maple Hollow knew was that this would be the last time they would see any of the 55 choir members alive. Inside the chapel's rehearsal hall, choir director Edwin Porter tapped his baton against the music stand. At 58, Porter was a stern taskmaster with a reputation for excellence. His silver hair was always impeccably combed, his posture rigid as the wooden pews behind him. "From the beginning, please, nearer, my God, to thee. And do mind the crescendo in the third measure. It's been falling flat." The choir members arranged themselves on the risers, sopranos and altos in front, tenors and basses behind. Among them was Sarah Caldwell, 19, whose soprano was said to be so pure it could make angels weep. Next to her stood her younger sister, Mary, 16, whose alto provided the perfect complement. 1, 2, 3. Porter counted off. The first notes rose into the rafters of the old chapel, built in 1802 on land that had once belonged to the native Wampanoag tribe. The building had survived fires, floods, and the occasional earthquake, standing as a testament to the town's resilience and faith. Outside, the wind picked up. Snow began to fall more heavily, swirling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate to those few who happened to be watching from nearby windows. Inside the chapel, the temperature dropped noticeably. Several choir members pulled their shawls and coats tighter, but none stopped singing. Porter was not a man who tolerated interruptions. "Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee." The voices swelled, filling every corner of the chapel with sound. In the back row, Thomas Jenkins, the blacksmith's son, was the first to notice the strange blue light seeping through the stained glass windows. He nudged his friend William Hayes, but didn't stop singing. Porter's glare kept them both in line. As the hymn progressed, the blue light intensified, casting eerie shadows across the wooden floors. The temperature continued to drop until breath clouded before every singer's face, creating a misty veil through which they peered at their music sheets. In the town square, 100 yards away, shopkeeper Elijah Brown was closing his general store when he heard the choir. Even through the howling wind and the distance, the singing seemed unnaturally clear, as if the voices were carried directly to his ears. "Strange," he muttered to himself. "Never heard them so clearly before." The singing grew louder, more intense. Inside the chapel, Porter had abandoned his usual restraint, urging the choir to greater heights of volume and emotion. His eyes gleamed with an unusual fervor as he conducted, his movements becoming more frantic, more demanding. The blue light pulsed in rhythm with the music. Several choir members later reported feeling lightheaded, but none stopped singing. It was as if the music itself had taken control, pulling the notes from their throats without conscious effort. At precisely 8:17 p.m., according to the pocket watch later found on the chapel floor, the singing reached a crescendo that should have been impossible for 55 human voices. Witnesses from 3 surrounding buildings described it as unearthly, piercing, and beautiful beyond words. Then, silence, absolute and complete. Elijah Brown, concerned by the abrupt cessation, gathered his courage and 2 neighbors to investigate. They approached the chapel cautiously, noting that no light now shone from its windows. When they pushed open the heavy wooden doors, they found the chapel empty. 55 hymnals lay open on the floor, arranged in the exact formation the choir would have stood in. 55 coats and hats hung neatly on hooks by the door. 55 pairs of boots and shoes were lined up beneath them. But of the 55 choir members and their director, there was no sign. The only sound was a faint, lingering note that seemed to hover in the air. The final harmony of "Nearer, my God, to Thee," suspended in time like the last breath of a dying man. And so began the mystery that would consume Maple Hollow for generations to come. A mystery that would reveal secrets buried deeper than the foundations of the chapel itself. The morning after the disappearance dawned clear and cold, the storm having passed in the night. Sunlight glinted off fresh snow, creating a deceptive picture of serenity that belied the chaos unfolding in Maple Hollow. Sheriff James Harrington stood in the empty chapel, hat in hand, staring at the abandoned hymnals. At 47, Harrington had served as sheriff for 15 years and had never encountered anything remotely like this. His weathered face, usually impassive, now showed clear signs of distress. "And you're certain no one left the building?" he asked Elijah Brown for what must have been the 10th time. "No one, Sheriff," Brown replied, his voice hoarse from repeating his account to various officials throughout the night. "We were watching the chapel from my store window. No one entered or left between the time the singing stopped and when we went to investigate." Harrington nodded slowly, trying to make sense of the impossible. 56 people don't simply vanish into thin air. There had to be an explanation, a secret passage perhaps, or a mass delusion among the witnesses. "We'll need to search the building again," he said. "Every inch. There must be something we've missed." By noon, families of the missing had gathered outside the chapel, held back by a hastily erected barrier of rope and wooden sawhorses. Their faces reflected varying stages of grief and disbelief. Some wept openly, others stood in stoic silence, as if waiting for a practical joke to reach its conclusion. Margaret Caldwell, mother of Sarah and Mary, pushed through the crowd toward Sheriff Harrington as he emerged from the chapel. "My girls, Sheriff," she said, her voice breaking. "Please tell me you found something. Anything." Harrington removed his hat, a gesture that spoke volumes before he even opened his mouth. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Caldwell. We're doing everything we can." Inside the chapel, Deputy William Foster was examining the floorboards beneath where the choir had stood. Something caught his eye, a fine, glittering dust that seemed to form a perfect circle around the area where the choir risers had been. "Sheriff," he called out, "you might want to see this." Harrington returned, kneeling beside his deputy. He ran a finger through the dust, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger. It felt gritty yet somehow oily, and it shimmered with an iridescence that reminded him of fish scales. "What do you make of it?" Foster asked. "I don't know," Harrington admitted. "Collect some in an envelope. We'll send it to the university in Boston for analysis." As the day progressed, more details emerged that only deepened the mystery. The chapel's registry book showed that all 55 choir members had signed in for rehearsal, along with Director Porter. The last entry, written in Porter's meticulous handwriting, simply read, "They are coming. God help us all." This discovery sent a new wave of panic through the town. Who was coming? And why would Porter, a man known for his rational mind and steady temperament, write such an ominous note? By evening, telegraph wires hummed with news of the disappearance. Reporters from Boston and even New York were already on trains bound for Maple Hollow. The small town was about to become the center of national attention. In the Reverend's office, a hastily assembled council of town elders met to discuss the situation. Mayor Henry Wilson, a portly man with a perpetually worried expression, paced before the window. "This will ruin us," he muttered. "Who will want to visit or do business with a town where people vanish without a trace?" 56 souls are missing, Henry," Reverend Blackwood snapped. "I think our reputation should be the least of our concerns." The Reverend had aged a decade in a day. His wife had been among the missing. She had joined the choir just 3 months prior, her alto voice a recent but welcome addition. "Of course, Thomas, I didn't mean—" Mayor Wilson trailed off, appropriately chastened. Dr. Samuel Pierce, the town physician, cleared his throat. "Has anyone considered that this might be, well, not natural?" The room fell silent. In 1887, even in a small New England town steeped in Puritan history, suggesting supernatural causes was not done in polite company, especially not among the town's leadership. "Explain yourself, Samuel," the Reverend said quietly. Dr. Pierce shifted uncomfortably. "I examined the chapel thoroughly. There are no hidden passages, no trap doors. The windows were all locked from the inside. And then there's the matter of the personal effects. Why would 56 people remove their shoes and coats before vanishing?" "What are you suggesting?" Mayor Wilson demanded. "I'm not suggesting anything specific," Dr. Pierce replied carefully. "I'm merely pointing out that we should perhaps broaden our thinking beyond conventional explanations." As the meeting continued, Sheriff Harrington was making a discovery of his own. In the chapel basement, accessible only through a narrow staircase behind the pulpit, he found a collection of documents that had been hidden behind a loose stone in the wall. The papers, yellowed with age, appeared to be records from the original construction of the chapel in 1802. Among them was a deed of sale for the land, written in flowery script that was difficult to decipher in the dim lantern light. One passage, however, stood out clearly. "Be it known that this land, purchased from Chief Metacomet's descendants, carries with it certain restrictions and obligations. The buyer acknowledges that the ground is sacred to the Wampanoag and promises that no blood shall ever be spilled upon it, lest the singers between worlds be awakened. This covenant shall bind all future owners in perpetuity." Harrington frowned, reading the passage again. The singers between worlds. He had never heard such a term before, despite having lived in Maple Hollow his entire life. As he continued reading, a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature ran down his spine. According to the documents, the chapel had been built directly over what the Wampanoag called the threshold, a place where, under certain conditions, the boundary between worlds grew thin. The sheriff carefully gathered the documents, knowing they might hold the key to understanding what had happened to the choir. As he climbed the stairs back to the main chapel, he heard something that made him freeze mid-step. Singing. Faint but unmistakable. The same hymn the choir had been practicing when they vanished. "Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee." The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if carried on the very air itself. Harrington rushed up the remaining stairs, bursting into the main chapel, only to find it empty, the singing gone as suddenly as it had begun. Outside, night was falling on Maple Hollow. 56 families prepared to spend their first night not knowing if their loved ones were alive or dead. And in the chapel, something waited, patient, ancient, and hungry for more voices to join its eternal choir. 3 days after the disappearance, Maple Hollow was transformed. The quiet town of 1,200 souls had swelled with an influx of outsiders, reporters, detectives, and curiosity seekers drawn by the increasingly sensational newspaper accounts of the vanishing choir. The Boston Herald's headline that morning read, "Entire church choir disappears without a trace. Supernatural forces suspected." The New York Times took a more measured approach. Mass disappearance in Massachusetts town baffles authorities. Sheriff Harrington had established a temporary headquarters in the town hall where he could better coordinate the search efforts and manage the growing crowd of investigators. The documents he had discovered in the chapel basement were spread across his desk, along with maps of the town dating back to its founding in 1785. A knock at the door interrupted his study. Detective Alistair Morgan from the Massachusetts State Police entered without waiting for a response. Morgan was everything Harrington was not: young, fashionably dressed, and brimming with metropolitan confidence. "Any progress, Sheriff?" Morgan asked, not bothering to hide the condescension in his tone. "Some," Harrington replied, gesturing to the documents. "I've been researching the history of the chapel. There might be something here that explains what happened." Morgan picked up one of the yellowed pages, skimming it with obvious skepticism. "The singers between worlds? Really, Sheriff? I expected better from you." "I'm exploring all possibilities," Harrington said evenly. "Something happened in that chapel, Detective. Something that can't be explained by any conventional means." Morgan set the paper down with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "There's always a rational explanation. People don't simply vanish into thin air. My money's on a mass exodus. Perhaps they've joined one of those utopian communities that are springing up across the country. Without their shoes, without their coats, in the middle of a snowstorm?" Harrington shook his head. "And what about the blue light witnesses reported? The unnatural cold inside the chapel?" "Mass hysteria," Morgan replied promptly. "One person imagines something unusual, shares it, and suddenly everyone believes they experience the same thing." Aye. Their discussion was interrupted by another knock. Deputy Foster entered, accompanied by an elderly man Harrington didn't recognize. "Sheriff, this is Professor James Whitaker from Harvard University. He's an expert in Native American history and folklore. I thought he might be able to help with those documents you found." Harrington stood, extending his hand to the professor. "Thank you for coming, Professor. I appreciate any insight you can provide." Whitaker was a small man with a neatly trimmed white beard and spectacles that magnified his pale blue eyes. Despite his advanced age, he had to be at least 70. He moved with surprising energy. "Fascinating case, Sheriff," Whitaker said, his voice stronger than his appearance suggested. "When I read about it in the papers, I knew I had to come. You see, I've spent 40 years studying Wampanoag legends, and this," he gestured to the documents on the desk, "this fits a very specific story I've encountered." Even Detective Morgan seemed interested now, pulling up a chair as Whitaker settled himself at the desk and began examining the papers. Yes, the professor murmured, "just as I thought. The singers between worlds. The Wampanoag believed in places where our world and the spirit world touched. Thresholds, they called them. And at these thresholds, certain beings existed that were neither fully of our world nor fully of the spirit world." "What kind of beings?" Harrington asked. "They had many names for them," Whitaker replied, "but the most common translation would be those who sing the soul away. According to legend, these entities were drawn to music, particularly sacred music, and could use it to, well, to harvest souls." Morgan snorted. "You can't seriously believe—" "I'm not saying I believe it," Whitaker interrupted. "I'm telling you what the Wampanoag believed. And according to this deed, the original purchasers of the land were warned about building on this particular spot." The professor pointed to a passage in the document. "See here? No blood shall ever be spilled upon it." The Wampanoag believed that blood, especially innocent blood, could awaken these entities and strengthen the connection between worlds. Harrington felt a chill run down his spine. "Has there ever been bloodshed at the chapel in its entire history?" Deputy Foster cleared his throat. "Actually, Sheriff, I've been looking into that. In 1862, during the Civil War, the chapel was briefly used as a field hospital for wounded soldiers being transported north. According to town records, 17 men died there. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. That's not all, Foster continued. I spoke with Mrs. Abernathy, you know, the town historian? She mentioned that in 1863, shortly after the chapel resumed normal services, the choir at that time reported hearing phantom voices joining them during rehearsals. What happened to that choir? Harrington asked, dreading the answer. Nothing, Foster replied. The reports stopped after a few weeks. Mrs. Abernathy thinks they just got used to the acoustics of the chapel after its use as a hospital. Professor Whitaker was examining a map of the town. Sheriff, do you know if there have been any disturbances to the land recently? Construction, perhaps, or excavation near the chapel? Harrington thought for a moment. The new water line. They dug up the street in front of the chapel last autumn to lay new pipes for the town's water supply. That could be significant, Whitaker said. According to Wampanoag belief, disturbing the earth around a threshold could weaken the boundary between worlds. What? Detective Morgan had been unusually quiet, but now he stood abruptly. This is absurd. We're wasting valuable time on fairy tales when we should be conducting a proper investigation. I'm going to interview the families again, see if anyone noticed unusual behavior in the days leading up to the disappearance. After Morgan left, Harrington turned back to the professor. Let's assume, just for argument's sake, that there's some truth to these legends. What happened to the choir members? Are they dead? Whitaker removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully. The legends aren't entirely clear on that point. The Wampanoag believed that those taken by the singers weren't exactly dead, but they weren't alive either. They existed in a state between worlds, their voices joining the eternal chorus. Is there any way to bring them back? Foster asked. That, Whitaker said gravely, is where the legends become even more troubling. There are stories of people being returned, but never the same as they were before, and the price for their return was always high. As they continued discussing the possibilities, a commotion outside drew their attention. Harrington moved to the window to see a crowd gathering in the town square. At its center stood a man he didn't recognize, tall, gaunt, and dressed entirely in black despite the cold. Who is that? He asked. Foster joined him at the window. Calls himself Thaddeus Blackwood. Arrived this morning claiming to be the Reverend's cousin from Philadelphia. Says he's a medium who can communicate with the missing. Blackwood? Harrington frowned. The Reverend never mentioned a cousin. That's what I thought, Foster agreed. But he has letters that seem to confirm the relationship, and several family members of the missing have already engaged his services. Harrington watched as the stranger addressed the crowd, his gestures dramatic and commanding. Even from a distance, there was something unsettling about the man, something in his too wide smile and the intensity of his gaze. Keep an eye on him, Harrington told Foster. The last thing we need is someone exploiting these families' grief. As night fell once again on Maple Hollow, new developments added layers to the mystery. Workers excavating near the chapel's foundation discovered a hidden chamber containing artifacts that appeared to be of Native American origin. Stone carvings depicting humanoid figures with open mouths, arranged in a circle. And in the town cemetery, the caretaker reported a disturbing phenomenon. From the graves of those who had died in the chapel during its brief tenure as a field hospital, a faint humming could be heard, the same hymn the choir had been singing when they vanished. The boundary between worlds was growing thinner, and something was preparing to cross over, something that had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. 1 week after the disappearance, Maple Hollow existed in a state of suspended animation. Normal life had ceased, businesses remained closed, children were kept home from school, and the streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional group of reporters or investigators hurrying from one location to another. In the Caldwell home, Margaret sat motionless by the window, as she had every day since her daughters vanished. The once vibrant woman, known for her infectious laugh and boundless energy, had become a hollow shell. Her husband, Robert, moved silently around her, placing cups of tea that went untouched and blankets that provided no warmth against the chill that seemed to emanate from within her. A knock at the door roused Robert from his vigil. He opened it to find Thaddeus Blackwood standing on the porch, hat in hand, his thin lips curved in what was likely meant to be a sympathetic smile, but came across as predatory. "Mr. Caldwell," Blackwood said, his voice as smooth as oil, "I've come to offer my services. I believe I can help you communicate with your daughters." Robert's first instinct was to slam the door in the man's face. He had heard about Blackwood, the self-proclaimed medium who had arrived in town shortly after the disappearance, claiming kinship with the Reverend and special abilities to contact the missing. "We're not interested," Robert said firmly. "I understand your skepticism," Blackwood continued undeterred, "but I've already helped several families receive messages from their loved ones. The Jenkins family, for instance. Young Thomas assured them he's not suffering, and Mrs. Porter received quite detailed communications from her husband." At the mention of the choir director's name, Margaret stirred for the first time in hours. "Edwin?" she whispered. "You've spoken with Edwin?" Blackwood's smile widened slightly. "Indeed, Mrs. Caldwell. He had much to say about the circumstances of their current situation." Before Robert could protest, Margaret was on her feet. "Let him in, Robert, please." Reluctantly, Robert stepped aside. As Blackwood passed him, the taller man leaned in slightly. "Hope, Mr. Caldwell. That's what I'm offering. Isn't that worth a few minutes of your time?" In the parlor, Blackwood declined offers of refreshment and got straight to business. He placed a small black velvet bag on the table and from it withdrew several objects: a silver pendulum, a small vial of clear liquid, and what appeared to be a human tooth. "What is that?" Robert demanded, pointing at the tooth. "A focus object," Blackwood explained casually. "It helps strengthen the connection to the other side." "Whose tooth is it?" Robert persisted. Blackwood smiled enigmatically. "That's not important. Now, do you have something that belonged to your daughters? Something personal, something they treasured?" Margaret immediately produced two items: a hair ribbon that had belonged to Sarah and a small wooden bird that Mary had carved herself. "Perfect," Blackwood said, taking the items and placing them in the center of the table. He poured a few drops from the vial around them, then began to swing the pendulum in slow, deliberate circles. "I call upon the spirits between worlds," he intoned, his voice dropping to a hypnotic cadence. "I seek Sarah and Mary Caldwell, taken from this realm but not yet passed to the next. If you can hear my voice, give us a sign." For several long moments, nothing happened. Robert was about to denounce the whole thing as a fraud when the temperature in the room plummeted. His breath clouded before his face, and the flames in the fireplace dimmed to barely glowing embers. Margaret gasped, clutching Robert's arm. "Do you feel that?" The pendulum, which had been swinging in regular circles, suddenly stopped, then began to move in a figure-8 pattern of its own accord. Blackwood's eyes widened in what seemed like genuine surprise. "They're here," he whispered. "Both of them together. Sarah, Mary," Margaret called out, her voice breaking. "Girls, can you hear us?" The pendulum swung faster, and a high, thin sound filled the room, like distant singing, barely audible, but unmistakably there. "Nearer, my God, to thee." "They're singing," Blackwood said, his face pale. "They're all singing." "Ask them if they're all right," Robert demanded, fighting against his own growing terror. "Ask them where they are." Blackwood closed his eyes, his face contorting as if in pain. They say they're in the between place, neither here nor there. They say they're not alone. The others are with them, the old ones, the first singers." "Can they come home?" Margaret sobbed. "Please ask them if they can come back to us." The pendulum's movement became erratic. The singing grew louder, and the temperature dropped even further. Frost began to form on the windows, spreading in patterns that resembled musical notes. "They say..." Blackwood's voice had changed, becoming deeper, resonating in a way that seemed impossible for his thin frame. "They say there is a way, Blood calls to blood. The threshold can be opened again. Suddenly, the pendulum flew from Blackwood's hand, striking the wall with such force that it embedded itself in the plaster. The singing stopped abruptly, and the room returned to its normal temperature. Blackwood slumped in his chair, breathing heavily. When he looked up, his eyes seemed different somehow, darker, with an unusual sheen like oil on water. "I apologize," he said, his voice normal again. "The connection was stronger than I anticipated. Your daughters, they have a message for you. They say you must come to the chapel at midnight on the full moon. Bring others who have lost loved ones. The veil will be thinnest then." "What will happen?" Robert asked, still shaken by what he had witnessed. "A chance," Blackwood said simply, "a chance to bring them home." After Blackwood left, Robert and Margaret sat in stunned silence. Despite his initial skepticism, Robert couldn't deny what he had experienced. Something had happened in that room, something beyond rational explanation. "We have to tell Sheriff Harrington," he finally said. Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes. But we're also going to the chapel on the full moon. I don't care what it takes, Robert. I want our girls back." Across town, Sheriff Harrington was meeting with Professor Whitaker and Dr. Pierce in the town hall. The three men were reviewing the latest findings from the excavation around the chapel. "The artifacts are definitely Wampanoag," Whitaker confirmed, examining a stone carving. "This circle of figures represents their concept of the chorus that exists between worlds. And these markings," he pointed to symbols etched into the base, "they're a warning. The song that binds can also release." "Release what?" Harrington asked. Whitaker's expression was grave. According to the legends, the singers between worlds weren't just collectors of souls. They were guardians, keeping something even more ancient contained, something that hungered for our world. Dr. Pierce, who had been examining samples of the strange dust found in the chapel, looked up sharply. "Sheriff, I've identified the substance. It's not dust at all. It's scales, microscopic scales, unlike anything I've ever seen. They're not from any fish or reptile known to science." Before Harrington could respond, Deputy Foster burst into the room. "Sheriff, there's been another incident at the Caldwell house. That medium, Blackwood, he conducted some kind of seance, and now the Caldwells are claiming they heard their daughters singing." "Blackwood," Harrington muttered. "I knew there was something off about him. What exactly happened?" Foster relayed what the Caldwells had told him, including the message about gathering at the chapel on the full moon. "When is the next full moon?" Harrington asked. 3 days from now," Whitaker replied immediately. "And it's not just any full moon, it's a blue moon, the second full moon in a month. In many cultures, such occurrences are believed to enhance supernatural energies." Harrington made a decision. "Foster, I want Blackwood brought in for questioning now, and post deputies at the chapel. No one goes in or out without my authorization." As Foster left to carry out his orders, Harrington turned back to Whitaker. "Professor, you mentioned that the song that binds can also release. Is there any indication in the legends of how to bring back those who were taken?" Whitaker hesitated. "There are references to a counter song, a harmony that could potentially reverse the process. But the texts are fragmentary and the risks are enormous." "What risks?" "If the boundary between worlds is opened again, there's no guarantee that only the choir would return. Whatever the singers are guarding could potentially escape as well." Dr. Pierce, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "Sheriff, I think we need to consider the possibility that this Blackwood person knows more than he's letting on. The timing of his arrival, his claimed relationship to the Reverend, his knowledge of the chapel, it's all too convenient." Harrington nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same thing, and there's something else that's been bothering me. The Reverend's wife was in the choir when it vanished, yet Blackwood claims to be the Reverend's cousin. Why hasn't he shown more concern about her?" The implications hung in the air, unspoken but clear. What if Blackwood wasn't just exploiting the situation? What if he was somehow involved in causing it? As night fell on Maple Hollow for the 7th time since the disappearance, new reports began to filter in from around town. In homes where choir members had lived, clocks stopped at 8:17 p.m., the exact time of the vanishing. Children reported hearing singing coming from empty rooms, and in the graveyard, the humming from the Civil War soldiers' graves grew louder, more insistent. The boundary between worlds was weakening, and the full moon was approaching. Whatever was going to happen, Harrington knew they were running out of time to prepare for it. And somewhere in Maple Hollow, Thaddeus Blackwood was smiling, his too wide grin reflecting the growing darkness as he whispered to himself, "Soon, very soon." 2 days before the full moon, Maple Hollow awoke to find frost covering every surface, despite the relatively mild overnight temperature. The frost formed patterns, not the random crystalline structures of natural ice, but deliberate designs that resembled musical notation. Experts who examined them confirmed they were fragments of "Nearer, My God, to Thee," the hymn the choir had been singing when they vanished. Sheriff Harrington stood on the steps of the town hall, surveying the eerie landscape. The search for Thaddeus Blackwood had proven fruitless. The self-proclaimed medium had vanished shortly after his séance with the Caldwells, leaving behind only rumors and growing fear. "Sheriff!" Deputy Foster called, hurrying up the steps. "We found something in the Reverend's study. You need to see this." In the small office adjacent to the chapel, Harrington examined what Foster had discovered. A hidden compartment in the Reverend's desk containing a journal and several letters. The correspondence was between Reverend Blackwood and someone named Thaddeus, dating back more than 20 years. "So he really was the Reverend's cousin," Harrington murmured, skimming the letters. "Not exactly," Foster replied. "Read the latest entry in the journal." Harrington turned to the journal, finding the last entry dated just 1 day before the choir's disappearance. February 12th, 1887. "He has found me at last. After all these years of hiding, of building a new life, he has tracked me down. Thaddeus sent word that he will arrive within the week. I have not told Martha. What could I say? How could I explain that my own brother, not cousin as I have always claimed, has devoted his life to the darkest of arts, that he blames me for the death of our parents and has sworn vengeance? The choir must be protected. I fear Thaddeus knows of the chapel's history, of what lies beneath it. If he should discover the full truth, if he should find a way to harness that power, I have hidden the original score where he will never find it. The countersong must be preserved, but never performed except in the direst need. God forgive me for what I have done. God protect us all from what may come." Harrington looked up from the journal, his expression grim. "Brothers, not cousins. And the Reverend was hiding from him. There's more," Foster said, handing Harrington a faded photograph he'd found, tucked between the journal's pages. "Look at this." The sepia-toned image showed 2 young men standing side by side, one clearly recognizable as a much younger Reverend Blackwood. The other, taller and thinner, with the same sharp features, could only be Thaddeus. Between them stood an older man in clerical garb, his hand resting on a book that appeared to be ancient, its binding elaborate and foreign. "Their father," Harrington guessed. "I think so," Foster replied. "And look at the inscription on the back." Harrington turned the photograph over. In faded ink, someone had written, "The Blackwood Men, with the Cantus Animarum, 1857. "Cantus Animarum," Harrington repeated. "What does that mean?" "It's Latin," came Professor Whitaker's voice from the doorway. The elderly academic entered, looking more haggard than when Harrington had last seen him. "It translates to Song of Souls." "Vi may I?" Harrington handed him the photograph, which Whitaker examined with intense interest. "Extraordinary," he murmured. "I've read references to this book, but I never thought it actually existed. According to legend, the Cantus Animarum contains musical compositions that can affect the boundary between worlds, opening it, closing it, even allowing one to control what passes through. And the Blackwood family had it, Harrington said, the implication sinking in. Not just had it, Whitaker corrected. According to my research, the Blackwoods were its custodians for generations. The family has a long history with the church and with occult studies. They walk the line between faith and forbidden knowledge. Foster frowned. So the Reverend and his brother both knew about this book. But the Reverend was trying to protect it, while Thaddeus wants to use it, Harrington finished. The question is, for what purpose? The answer came sooner than expected. As they continued searching the study, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window they could see a crowd gathering around someone in the town square. Even from a distance, the tall, gaunt figure was unmistakable. "Blackwood," Harrington growled, reaching for his revolver. "Let's go." By the time they reached the square, Thaddeus Blackwood had drawn a considerable audience. Standing on a wooden crate, his black coat flapping in the cold breeze, he addressed the townspeople with the fervor of a revival preacher. "The time approaches," he called out, his voice carrying unnaturally far. "2 nights hence, when the moon is full, the veil will thin, and your loved ones can return. I have communed with them. They wait in the between place, longing for home." Harrington pushed through the crowd, Foster and Whitaker close behind. "Thaddeus Blackwood," he shouted. "You're wanted for questioning." Blackwood's gaze snapped to the sheriff, and for a brief moment Harrington could have sworn the man's eyes were completely black. Then Blackwood smiled, and they were normal again, or as normal as his unsettling pale blue eyes ever appeared. "Sheriff Harrington," Blackwood said smoothly, "I've been expecting you. Have you found my brother's journal, his confession?" The question caught Harrington off guard. "Confession? What are you talking about?" Blackwood's smile widened. Did he not record the truth about what he did 30 years ago, about the sacrifice that sealed the threshold? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Many of Maple Hollow's residents had known Reverend Blackwood for decades, had trusted him implicitly. The suggestion that he harbored dark secrets clearly disturbed them. "Thomas would never," began Mrs. Abernathy, the town historian, but Blackwood cut her off with a laugh. "Never what? Never kill? Never use blood magic? You didn't know my brother as I did. You didn't see what he was capable of when our parents threatened to destroy the Cantus Animarum." Harrington stepped closer, hand still on his revolver. "You're under arrest, Blackwood. We can discuss your accusations at the jail." "I think not, Sheriff," Blackwood replied, his voice suddenly deeper, resonating in a way that made several people in the crowd cover their ears in pain. "I have work to complete. My brother began the ritual 30 years ago, binding the singers to his will, using them to guard the threshold. But he lacked the courage to finish what he started. I will not make the same mistake." Before Harrington could draw his weapon, Blackwood made a sharp gesture with his hand. A high-pitched tone cut through the air, and everyone in the square except Blackwood himself froze in place, unable to move. "A simple application of the principles in the Cantus," Blackwood explained conversationally, stepping down from his crate and approaching Harrington. "Sound affects the soul, Sheriff. The right frequencies can paralyze, can kill, or can open doors between worlds." He leaned in close, his breath smelling of something metallic and strange. "My brother took my family from me. Now I've taken his. But that was just the beginning. When the moon is full, I will open the threshold completely. The singers will release what they've guarded for millennia, and this world will be remade in song." With another gesture, he released them from their paralysis. Several people collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. "2 nights," Blackwood called out, already walking away. "Come to the chapel if you wish to see your loved ones again. All are welcome. I need witnesses for what is to come." As suddenly as he had appeared, Blackwood was gone, slipping between 2 buildings and vanishing from sight. Harrington immediately organized a search party, but he had little hope they would find the man if he didn't wish to be found. Back in the town hall, Harrington, Foster, Whitaker, and Dr. Pierce gathered to assess the situation. He's insane, Dr. Pierce declared, clearly suffering from delusions. Insane, perhaps, Whitaker agreed. But that doesn't mean he's not dangerous. You all felt it, that paralysis was real. Whatever this cantus animarum contains, it grants its user considerable power. Harrington paced the room. The Reverend mentioned hiding the original score, the countersong. We need to find it. And we need to understand what Blackwood meant about the Reverend beginning a ritual 30 years ago, Foster added. Mrs. Abernathy might know. She's been keeping the town records for almost 50 years. A search of the town archives revealed a disturbing pattern. 30 years earlier, in 1857, 3 children had gone missing from Maple Hollow within the span of a month. Their disappearance had coincided with the arrival of Thomas Blackwood, then a young seminary student who had come to assist the aging minister. Shortly after the children vanished, Blackwood had left town abruptly, only to return 5 years later as the new Reverend, married and seemingly a changed man. The dates match what Thaddeus was saying, Foster noted grimly. And look at this, the chapel underwent major renovations that same year. The floor was completely replaced. A sacrifice, Whitaker murmured. Blood to seal the threshold. Harrington shook his head in disbelief. Are you suggesting that Reverend Blackwood, the man this town has trusted for 25 years, murdered 3 children and buried them under the chapel floor? I don't want to believe it either, Whitaker replied. But it would explain why he was so desperate to keep his brother away, why he hid the cantus. He wasn't just protecting the town, he was hiding his own crimes. As they grappled with these revelations, Margaret Caldwell arrived at the town hall, her husband Robert at her side. Her face was drawn with grief, but her eyes burned with determination. Sheriff, she said without preamble, I've been to the Reverend's house. I found something hidden in a compartment beneath the floorboards in his bedroom. She placed a leather-bound folder on the table. Inside was a sheaf of yellowed parchment covered in musical notation, unlike anything Harrington had ever seen. The notes seemed to shift and move on the page, making his eyes water if he looked at them too long. The countersong, Whitaker breathed, reaching for the manuscript with trembling hands. This must be what the Reverend mentioned in his journal. There was a letter with it, Margaret continued, producing a sealed envelope. Addressed to you, Sheriff. Harrington broke the seal and unfolded the letter, recognizing the Reverend's neat handwriting. Sheriff Harrington, if you are reading this, then my fears have been realized. My brother has come to Maple Hollow, and I am either dead or unable to stop what he has set in motion. I must confess to sins that have haunted me for 30 years. As a young man, blinded by ambition and the promise of power, I performed a ritual from the cantus animarum. 3 innocent lives were sacrificed to bind the singers between worlds to my will, to force them to maintain the seal on the threshold beneath the chapel. What lies beyond that threshold cannot be allowed into our world. The ancients called it the devourer of songs, an entity that consumes souls and the music they create. My brother believes he can control it, use it to grant him immortality. He is wrong. No mortal can control such power. The enclosed score is the countersong, the only means to strengthen the seal should it weaken. But beware, it comes at a price. Those who perform it must be pure of heart and willing to sacrifice. The singers demand balance. What was taken must be returned. I have lived with my guilt for 3 decades, building a life of service in futile attempt at atonement. Now as judgment approaches, I can only pray that my sins will not doom all of Maple Hollow. May God forgive what I cannot undo. Thomas Blackwood. Silence fell over the room as Harrington finished reading. The confession confirmed their worst fears while raising new questions. What exactly was this devourer of songs? And what sacrifice would the countersong require? The full moon is tomorrow night, Foster said quietly. What are we going to do? Harrington looked at the musical score, then at the faces around him, each showing varying degrees of shock, fear, and determination. "We're going to stop Blackwood," he said firmly, "and we're going to bring those people home." As night fell on Maple Hollow, a strange calm descended on the town. The frost patterns had spread, covering every building with ghostly musical notes. And from the chapel, though it stood empty and guarded, the faint sound of singing could be heard, 56 voices, joined now by 3 childish voices that had been silent for 30 years, all calling out from the space between worlds. The final confrontation was approaching, and the song that would determine the fate of Maple Hollow was about to be sung.